Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you all so much for joining us for the second in our Centering Youth Thriving webinars. We are thrilled to have you here today to talk more about helping systems understand their role in supporting ecosystems, and in particular, the Too Essential to Fail paper. To get us started, we would love to have everyone share in the chat what thriving means to you. We're going to be talking a lot today about centering youth thriving, about youth thriving and ecosystems, and would love to start just by having everyone share what thriving means to you. And while you're doing that, would love to introduce our speakers for today. We are lucky to be joined by Karen Pittman and Merita Irby. For 3 decades now, Karen and Merita have worked to promote positive youth development by steadily shifting the narrative about the role of communities in improving youth thriving. Their work together began at the Center for Youth Development and Policy Research, which Karen co-founded with Michelle Cahill in 1990. After stints in the Clinton administration and at the International Youth Foundation and supporting the startup of America's Promise, Karen and Merita co-founded the Forum for Youth Investment, a national nonprofit committed to changing the odds for youth. After nearly 25 years, Karen and Merita stepped away from organizational management to dedicate their time to galvanizing the growing interest in using science-informed strategies to profoundly change the odds that all children and youth can be successful. And in 2021, I was lucky to launch Knowledge to Power Catalyst alongside Karen and Merita, where we work to amplify ideas, advise initiatives, and align partners to accelerate change. In addition to our consulting and advising, we partnered to co-create a major cross-field alignment effort centering youth thriving that engages leaders of major networks, alliances, and campaigns working to improve systems and conditions for children and youth. So we'll be talking more about that today, and would love to have you keep adding to the chat what thriving means to you. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Karen and Merita.
Thank you, Catherine. It's great to see all of you today, and folks that we both know well, and some new friends in this work as well. And we're just excited that you're here. We know it's August. It's a little bit of a quieter month. A lot of folks registered, but we were wanting to really have more of an informal conversation today. I think one of the things that we'll be doing along the way is just dropping into the chat the publication that we did together back that was released in February, Too Essential to Fail, the commission piece with Education Reimagined, which I know many of you have seen, and wanted to take some time to kind of unpack that, but also really bring it up to the present moment with conversations we've been having with folks over the last 6 months since the paper came out. Really thinking about, like, why is now the moment to talk about how systems really do need to think and operate, and the people within them, in different ways to really make sure that we have thriving, vibrant ecosystems of learning and development that really support our young people. And how are we really thinking about young people as the potential and the possibilities, not just for the future, but for now, in terms of how we're addressing different challenges that we face in our communities, but also just how they're assets in their own learning and development. How do we think about this all a little bit differently? So we're going to take some time to kind of unpack that today. I think you've got the paper in the chat. We're going to go through in a little bit of a different order. As we wrote it originally, it was really this effort to bring together into one place sort of a collective process with folks from different working groups, the Science and Learning Development Alliance, and now with our Centering Youth Thriving crew of folks really weighing in to say, what's the evidence, and how do we sort of bring this together in a way that really makes the argument for thinking differently about how we need to do business, not just in school systems, but in the community-based systems as well, and how are we bringing those together? So we had the paper organized really around 4 things. One was really looking at the convergence of public opinion and perspectives of young people, parents, employers, educators in the classroom, educators in the community, really coming together and saying, we are thinking in very similar ways about what thriving looks like, and what and what we think it takes to get there. So very commonalities in that, but we also really pulled together the research and evidence base behind that, going back, kind of back to the future to some of the frameworks from 20 years ago and refreshing and updating that, and then bringing it together with more recent work around the brain science and science of learning development. How do we think about that in terms of the research and evidence base? And then really looking at what are the places that are already like the starting points for bringing about a different way of doing business? What are the kinds of infrastructure and communities that are already there that we can build upon, schools included, but also the kinds of things that are in mayor's offices and provider networks and others? What are some of those levers for change? And this has been the conversation with folks over the last 6 months as the papers come out as well. So what are some of those big swings and starting points that we can really all lean into together? And then really an exploration in the last section of just how did that change and how it happens and how can we really kind of find a path forward together. So we're going to explore those things, but kind of in a different order today. We really do want to start with thriving and ecosystems, as Catherine was saying, and then also just why is one of the things that we think critically important to really focus in on that second decade into the third decade, that focus on adolescents, teenagers and young adults. Why is really thinking about their daily experience something that can help us work together in a different way from the different places and spaces that we structure and organize on behalf of young people. So we're going to take some time to kind of play through those. If you've got the link, I'm just going to invite you on a few of these. I'll just say, like, look at page. Right now, just if you look at page 10, you're going to see a couple of images there around just the portrait of graduate efforts, the kinds of things that I'm looking at, like what people are saying to thrive. It's not just a set of competencies, although those are critically important, but looking in the chat, the kinds of things about agency, and it's not just individual, but it's collective, that it is thriving for people, but it's also around the community and the ecosystem, being the best version of yourself. You guys have seen them kind of come in through the chat. I'm just scanning back through it with you now. But how are we thinking about thriving, having the skills, the knowledge, the abilities to make intentional choices about their future, having basic needs met? It's not all just about what you can do. It's also just that the kinds of things that really help you in the daily basis in your life to be able to survive and thrive. So as we're thinking about those different things, the other thing I'd ask you to scooch on over to page 11, you'll see a graphic there that is something that the National League of Cities developed during the pandemic to really focus in on the range of places and spaces and opportunities that young people are needing and tapping into, and just a way to visualize that. Karen's been playing with that one. We used it to kick off the Centering Youth Thriving meeting that we had in April to really kind of unpack and explore, like, what are we really thinking about when we're saying the ecosystems, that combination of people, places, and possibilities, and how you kind of turn on the light between those different places and see the connections that are there. So Karen, I'm going to turn it over to you now and ask you to just kind of chat us through that a little bit.
All right. Well, stick it up on the screen and we'll do a quick chat. I have threatened that I can do this in 5 minutes. It may take a little bit more, but
the first 5 slides.
The first 5 slides, I think I can get through in 5 minutes, and then we'll chat about them. So we're really trying to get to this idea of centering youth thriving as a way to really give guidance to systems, the public school system, our out of school time systems, or other systems, about how they can really turn from looking inward to looking outward. And so I've always loved this graphic from the National League of Cities, and you go to the next one. And that's it. So we're going to talk about 5 slides, 5 minutes. I've sort of deconstructed and reconstructed this graphic to give us a sense of really how we can understand how we get from all these little icons of organizations and the individual things that we think young people need to have, how those really come together when we think about the intersection between people, places, and possibilities. So go to the next one. So we all understand that schools are primarily responsible for academic preparation, but because they have responsibility for having kids all day, most of the year, they've also become multi-service agencies. And that's important. And we understand that. And when you look at the data that's in the paper about why schools are so important, the idea that they really do custodial care is a big deal for families, for working families, et cetera. The concept of community schools is an important one. And we talked about that in the paper as well, because community schools really were schools' intentional effort to say, how do we think about the whole child? How do we expand learning opportunities? How do we think about wraparound services and the other things that young people need to have to thrive? How are we more intentional about engaging families? And then doing this shared leadership. So we're really bringing the community in to say, how can we make our schools better and more responsive to the community? That's an important step in the community schools movement. Is a really important movement for us to latch onto. We're looking for footholds to move forward. But there are other institutions in the community. And often when you look at school-centered graphics, you just have this ring that says community without naming who's in the community. We know that there are other institutions in the community that really are committed to learning and development, not just providing essential basic services, but committed to enrichment and engagement. And those organizations are working with young people differently because they are voluntary. And people often go in the out-of-school hours and the summer hours, but they go driven by their interests. Families recognize this. And the Learning Heroes study that was done a while ago just shows that families that find out-of-school activities extremely valuable and important for their young people. But we also know that they're highly inequitable. Along the way, we've had systems, intermediaries, youth development intermediaries, some of you are on the phone right now, really saying municipalities can try to equalize these services by connecting them and building an infrastructure around them. And that's there and that's growing. That's another foothold we can use with children's cabinets and local after-school networks, et cetera, that are coming together. But when we look at this idea of how we really get to ecosystem, we've got to think about that sharing goals and increasing coordination between organizations and systems helps. But the secret sauce is getting the people in these organizations to connect, getting the connection between the people, the programs, the systems. That's where we start to get to this idea of an ecosystem and of a learning and development ecosystem. And the people in that system really matter. So we know, for example, we've been talking a lot to schools, even acknowledging that half the people in the building are not classroom teachers, and acknowledging their importance and thinking about how they can create a larger ecosystem for learning and development, for learning, and how learning doesn't just happen in the classroom, but other places in the school is important. You go out to those other organizations and we have many more people who are working in those organizations voluntarily with young people, but often in isolation from each other, without enough of a structure to say how do libraries connect to museums, connect to employment and services programs, connect to recreation centers. That's an infrastructure that needs to be built, a coordinating infrastructure. And then finally, when you go out into the community at large, where we know there's all this experience and interest in working with young people and helping young people, but they're not connected. These are all really weak connections that can be made much stronger. And that's what we want to talk about. So go to the next one. If we can really think about how we can help our systems, our school system clearly, because they've got the primary responsibility, but all those other systems and organizations, how we can really help them think about how to optimize the people, places, and possibilities in this learning and development ecosystem by looking outward and having really supports to look outward. That's what we want to do. And we want to emphasize this idea of ecosystem stewardship. We talked a little bit about that on our last webinar, July 2nd. We had Tom McKeagle from the University of Pittsburgh, who studies ecosystems, and we had Tyler Sintag from Remake Learning come on, who's just been doing incredible work in the Pittsburgh area, and talk about what they've been doing to get people across places to connect and understand. We're trying to move from this idea of deficits to this idea of assets and abundance. And when you think about all these people that can be connected, it gets us much more optimistic. And so we go to the next slide. This is from the book that Shift's report that Remake Learning just put out at their conference they had in May. And it's this wonderful definition that says, reminds us, learning ecosystems can be found anywhere. We're not making them, they exist, but they are highly inequitable. If we want them to really be available and equitable, we have to think about careful stewardship to help them thrive. I won't read the rest of this, but it's examples that when we get intentional about thinking about what it takes to support the ecosystem development, which is outside of systems, and stewarding these connections, stewarding these interactions, that makes it possible. And so we want you to just look at this. This is pulled directly from the Shift document. We'll put a link to that in the chat as well. But we're really inspired by the meeting that they had to say, shifting our thinking can shift our reality. By broadening our view of education to include the entire learning ecosystem, we can unlock the limited potential for learning inherent in our communities. And that's what they've been doing. And they've been doing this now for 20 years. And they've done a really wonderful job of just getting people and places and possibilities mixed up and much more visible in their interactions. And so they've talked about how they can make these shifts. And we just want to stop here to say, is this helping us? All your definitions of thriving were amazing. But we know that when we talk to school districts about thriving, they get a little bit nervous. We can't be responsible for all that. Our job over this next couple of webinars is to help us think about how we can make these interconnected systems much more visible. We can make these abundant opportunities much more visible. So we can really give people confidence that we can shift our systems in a way that really supports ecosystem stewardship. I'm going to stop there and see if you've got comments and questions.
This is a point where we just encourage you to come off of come on screen, to come off mute. We'll take us off spotlight. I'll maybe move this over to the side so we can keep them up there for just a minute. But the conversation that we wanted to have with you is really just from where you sit, and this is a conversation we've been having with folks in the Center Youth Thriving work. It's just, does this kind of get at it? Are there other shifts that we think are really important? Which ones of these speak to you? Are there things you would add to this list? We have a slightly longer version, wordsmith, that Tyler's been very gracious to let us play with. But just when you're thinking about kind of both shifts in thinking that really lead to shifts in action, as we're thinking about not just next, but now. What
I am good morning, ladies.
Say name, and for everybody,
Hi,
other folks, say where you're from.
Steve Heath, Fab Newport in Rhode Island. So love the diagrams. Obviously, you guys, I appreciate your work, and the thing that trying to work on is all that, everything makes sense, but how do we support the children and their families in taking ownership over their stories, and using the most contemporary tools possible in order to do that? I'll tell you a very quick story. I was talking to a 12-year-old kid in our camp. I asked him what he's thinking about for his future, where he wants to live, what his dream car is. His dream car is a Ferrari F4. He wants to live in Miami, and he wants to be a NASCAR driver, right? So, hey, that's a long way to go. But if a community's connected, we could start connecting him to all kinds of different experiences and people that could honor his vision, and who knows where it ends up. We have to keep weaving that together with all those little lines that you guys have.
Yep.
But how do we do that? And without, using tools that we have today, because one person, one school can't do it. Only a community can do it together.
You're absolutely right. And that's really one of the reasons that we wanted to do this, come out of our work over the past 6 months to do this set of webinars. I think the next one coming up is Michelle Cahill, looking at the XQ work and how they really have been bringing this idea of competencies and design principles and how we get to transformative learning experiences to help high schools. They focus on high schools, to help high schools really help young people move forward. And then after that, we're going to have, which you should all tune in for, I think on September 2nd, September 6th. Which one is it, Catherine?
It's the 6th.
6th.
It's Tuesday.
We're going to have Josh Shachter from Community Share and one of his colleagues from another version of Community Share that's been set up in Las Cruces come on to talk about exactly what you said, Steve. And his work is so exciting because what he's done is to say, just as you said, Steve, there are all these people in the community who have rich experiences and can really understand how to help young people connect to their dreams, but they don't know how to connect to the young people. And when we talk to teachers, we talk to educators, community educators about how they can do that, they say, I understand the importance of it, I just don't know how. And when you come on to hear the Community Share webinar, you're going to hear that they have really spent 10 years thinking about what an incredible platform you can create to help people connect, to help people really personalize their experiences and their interests in a profile, help educators personalize what their young people want to learn, and then literally connect these together in a match.com kind of an approach. And it's blown up things. And the same happened in Pittsburgh. And so these examples are so important. And we're trying to say, it's not just an idea that we can do it. We really can create the infrastructure to do it. But infrastructure isn't brick and mortar infrastructure. It's stewardship.
It's the people. And I think one of the things that you'll hear when Josh talks about it, there is an app, but it's not about the app. It's about the steward role that really helps make those connections happen. And Michelle, I see, speaking as being one of those stewards, I see that you're off mic. Share your thoughts on that. Yeah.
So we've been working hard to really expand this and scale up
because we already have groups that we're working with. We work with 37 local level groups. Connecticut doesn't have counties, so we have 169 towns. So some of these are very small and some of them are our largest cities. And I think that the piece that you're talking about in terms of relationships is spot on. But you need a person who's going to be the glue. You need somebody who sets the table that invites everybody in. And what we're really finding is that this is a political problem that requires infrastructure and resources to pay for that person. And that it has to be public source. It's not possible to scale up on private sources. So we've been focusing a lot of our effort at the legislative and governor's table to try and get them to understand that if they want their investments in education and early education and youth development to be realized and to not fade away or not be inequitable, they really have to invest in enough money to pay for that person to set the table. Because if you don't have consistency, that person's kind of the glue. They know when when a family comes to them and says, you know, I need this before I can engage in education. I need, you know, a referral for a mental health service. You need somebody who knows which mental health services have an opening that are on the bus line, right? And that takes that one person. So we're really finding it a bit of a struggle to convince people who want to invest in services. You know, everybody likes to help the kid directly, and they don't want to support the infrastructure, because if it's in this case, they see it as a zero-sum game that you're taking money away from the kids to pay for that person who's the local facilitator. And it's really been a bit of a challenge to educate people, especially legislators, with so many other things that they're thinking about. So any resources or suggestions you have for succinctly making the case for infrastructure funding and how that then leverages their investments in other ways would be fabulous. That's really where I struggle to make that into a little 3 bullet point elevator speech when I'm talking to legislators.
Yeah, no, I think that's fantastic. And working together on exactly what that elevator speech is in that case is part of, I think, the work that's directly in front of us now. So would love to work on that with you. And I think one of the things that's interesting when you think about that kind of steward, we're finding, even the idea of stewardship, in an ecosystem, ecosystems are more organic, but you still need some structure within them, right? So figuring out how to talk about that is that it is at different levels, right? So that around the daily life and experiences of the young person as they're not just people that are helping them kind of co-navigate across that, but things like the community share, where it's like, I'm really looking at the experiences happening, connecting at people to people at the experience level. And then also the stewards that really are setting those tables that really are sort of extra system in a way. You need some within systems to do that coordination and be able to look outwards. This has been a lot of the conversation with the folks that are thinking about the redesign of school systems, is how do they, tithe some time and some money and support to not just coordinating inward differently, but connecting and turning outward in those connections. And then folks working across setting the table across the places at the state level, like you are, or like Tyler's doing in Pittsburgh, that really can only do their function because they're not inside necessarily of one, but they're thinking about how to connect across. So figuring out how to do that, I'll send you something I've been playing with, which is a levels of stewardship kind of graphic. But I think that just figuring out how to make the case that it's the relationships that and the connections that matter, and in the experience of the young people, and how these roles help make sure that happens.
We've also had a lot of luck combining and leveraging early education and childcare work with the youth development work, because it's the same families, it's the same kids over time. And having those two work together, which is a little bumpy sometimes, but I think has been really powerful.
I think that conversation is great too, because the place that we were about to go to next was, because we often start sort of early, and then in a lot of the school conversations and the whole child work and that it really has a bit of more focus on elementary, maybe up into middle school. And then this conversation that Michelle Cahill and others have really been leading, of how do we think about high schools differently, and really rethink high school, but say, especially if you're thinking ecosystems, it just makes so much more sense to think about the broader ecosystem when you think about, sorry, when you think about adolescence, to think about the ecosystem, because it is developmentally, it's where they're supposed to be. Developmentally, adolescents are to be out and about, risk-taking, but in supported environments. It's part of the path, and how we really kind of think about and get into that a little bit. So one of the things that we've been playing with really is it's a both and, but if we can also think about, in particular, what we know about the science of adolescence, the adolescent brain. It's not just the child brain. It's not just the, an immature adult brain. It really is tailored to that stage of life. And it is about exploration and kind of the risk taking, as we're talking about it, but in appropriate ways, so they can develop those skills. How do we think about that, and bringing in that science of what we know, and all the adolescent brain research and all of that into this conversation? We found it's really been helpful for people to think about that you really do need that combination. And it's not just what we're supporting young people in doing, but that communities and our society really needs thriving youth to be able to handle the challenges that we're going through today, that they really are at the vanguard of many of these things, and that they need those thriving ecosystems. But you can't just, sometimes we talk about ecosystems, it starts to sound amorphous, and it's not letting the systems off the hook, basically, or trying to imagine something without the systems. You really need systems that are also thriving, that are effective, that are making the difference that they've set out to do, but that are doing it in a way that's thinking about the connections that a young person needs throughout their day, throughout their week, throughout their year, and helping to make those things happen. So it is really trying to think about how, in some ways, an understanding of what we know about how young people learn and develop, especially as they hit those adolescence years, makes us think more about all the places, spaces, and possibilities in that kind of ecosystem. I'm seeing some things in the chat, just in how we think about that kind of infrastructure, and really be able to kind of lift that up, so that could be the steward, when we think about the ecosystem, that kind of stewardship of the role to go along with the infrastructure is one of the key things that we're finding it's useful. So in the paper, the other piece that we really tried to pull together and explore is really that we do know that some things make a difference, and frankly, as you enter into adolescence, it's not too late, that we really do need to think about those connections, and considering you thriving, and that when you thrive, we all thrive. And one of the things that we've been working on with the various folks that have been on this journey with us was actually going back to the work that Michelle Gambone and Jim Connell did back a couple decades ago, to really look at what makes a difference, what matters most for youth, and what the connections are, the research connections are there. So when you get to the research part of the paper, and this is like page, I think, 29, if you want to scooch over there and see the full picture. Part of what was exciting about what they did, and thinking about thriving, right, is that combination of healthy, productive, connected, grounded in some way, is that they really looked across the kind of rolled up just reams of research, looking not just at like what are the outcomes, but what are the connections that help to make them happen. Really looking at things and trying to define, kind of in a rolled up, like doing well versus doing poorly on some very basic things in terms of just economic self-sufficiency when you're thinking about young adulthood, healthy family, social relationships, community involvement, and had some basics in terms of each of those to say, are you showing up and contributing at a community activity once a month? Are you in a faith organization? Just some minimums on there. And if you're doing that, that was sort of in the doing well category. And they had other kind of indicators they could look at for doing poorly on each of those. And what they found in terms of just long-term outcomes, that basically, and we found this in community work for decades, when you'd ask people to look at their data, more or less you could sort of have 4 in 10 young people doing well, 2 in 10 young people doing really poorly, and then this whole group that was kind of in the middle, another 4 in 10 that were not doing well on 2 or more of the major areas of thriving. And it was trying to look at, do we really know that there are some things that can make a difference in that? You backed up and looked at like how they were doing as young people in terms of learning to navigate, be productive, looking at some of those developmental outcomes, what they found as they looked at the research is that we do know, and this is all stuff that we've all talked about for ages, some key things do make a difference. Yeah, those basic needs have to be met, but you also need those supportive relationships. You lead with relationships, those opportunities for involvement, challenging, engaging, learning experiences and knowledge development, that these things are like the key to be able to get to those outcomes. What they found when they did the research and looking at it in kind of life trajectory is that just even controlling for one of those things, young people having healthy developmental relationships as they entered high school, that they were 4 times more likely to leave 5 times more likely to leave high school ready if they had those developmental relationships. And if they were leaving high school ready, they were 4 times more likely to be doing well as young adults as they hit their mid-20s. So they had similar effects for the other areas in terms of learning experiences, in terms of the opportunities for contribution, but even just controlling on one of those powerful relationships, it made a difference. And high school wasn't too late to make a difference. What folks have liked about this is we've been working with the various teams and working groups just looking at this work is not just that the research behind it still holds true, but it's a way for people to, no matter what system or setting they're sitting in, realize that nobody owns the whole picture. We all have to contribute in it together, and that they kind of like, I just have one outcome or indicator that I'm responsible for isn't really how it should work. We should, like the conversations we've been having with school leaders, Peter, you can talk about this, is really the meaning, the purpose of schools should not just be around academics. Everybody's been saying that forever, but that even to get that outcome, you need to be focusing on these other aspects of development. So it helps paint the picture, but also in our conversations with school leaders really helps paint and you're not in this alone. We're here with you. You don't have to understand that thriving is important and then say that you are the one and only one system that has to be responsible for that, even though a lot of things are co-located often in school systems, but it really does take that community and that range of actors. So it drives us back to that ecosystems picture that Karen was talking about. And then Michelle, like as you were saying, the broader, like what needs to happen in the policy environment, what needs to happen in terms of the infrastructure to make that coordination happen, to like get folks kind of moving in the same direction, that takes infrastructure and staffing and commitment and money as well to really be able to make that happen. So this is a revised version of that Michelle Gambo framework. It's the lead kind of that we have in the research section on the paper. And then we just go into other things around like the search for the assets, the University of Chicago Consortium of School Research, looking at what happens in the developmental stages. All of these really are preponderance of evidence saying assets matter. It's not just about addressing challenges or problems, and we've become increasingly focused on them since the pandemic, but that the assets matter and that there is really an abundance of assets across communities that can be galvanized towards this picture.
Yeah. And we've just spent the past year really road testing this framework because it was 20 years old, to say, is this still relevant? And what should we need to do to update it? And there's a lot of enthusiasm for actually updating the research behind it to say, is Irby still there? People are pretty comfortable that we haven't improved a lot in our things. But the reason that this research was so powerful when it came out, and we took it on the road for like 3 or 4 years to communities, was that it just simplified the idea that we can make change. When Merita says, when they looked at the young adults, they said only 4 out of 10 were doing well and 2 out of 10 were really struggling. What they found was a very simple statement. If going into the high school years, every young person had strong positive relationships, challenging opportunities, and meaningful learning experiences, if they had those throughout their high school years, we could change the number of young people doing well from 4 out of 10 to 7 out of 10. And I just want to emphasize that because that's a policy shift that not many people can claim. That if we do these basic things, we can almost double the number of young people who are doing well. And when we would say that to the communities would say, well, why can't we get to 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10? I said, this was starting in high school. Imagine what happens if we take this all the way back. We're just showing you that, again, it's so important for us to focus on adolescence. Because if you've seen the Frameworks Institute's research on adolescence, for example, adolescence is such a profoundly misunderstood time period. We've got a huge mismatch between what young people really need to do developmentally and what we let them do. When we spoke to the NEA a couple months ago, and this was their leadership group, They were talking about the fact that one of the teachers was saying, I have a 10th grader who's not allowed to leave campus for safety reasons. Well, how can a young person grow and experience and understand what's going on if they're not allowed to leave the campus? We understand the school's safety, but we also have to balance that. And so when you look at the public opinion research that was in the front of the paper, and the important things that people are saying they need adolescents to be able to do, we talk about it in K-12 language, but the language about what we want young people to have in terms of competencies and real life experiences and ready for work is all focused on those adolescent years, that last half of school. And so just asking schools to step into a space with other organizations and asking youth organizations. And often we know in a youth organization, your population starts to dwindle off at 7th or 8th grade. You start to lose them because we're not doing the things developmentally that young people need to be doing to thrive. And so having young people manage their risks, but take risks, knowing that they had to do that, and having us really understand what the business community understands, which is young people are the source of innovation in our future. If we don't get them ready, we're not going to be ready. And so that's why we just thought, how can we turn this around to saying, not just we have to support our young people, even though they're acting out and doing things and in bad shape, but how do we really get communities to understand that when young people thrive, communities thrive? Start it that way. And then say, when young people have ecosystems, they can thrive. And then we can get into this conversation about how you get the specifics of where the people, places, and possibilities connecting better together. Yeah. So let's look at any ways to move forward together. And a dog barking. Excuse me. Yeah, Steve, to your question about moving forward together, I think what we're going to be doing is over the next couple of sessions, what we're just doing in general, is really bringing together the energy behind the people who are trying to think about how to reform schools inside of schools, along with the people who are really excited about the fact that we may have an opportunity because we're shifting how we're getting rid of that juggernaut of the Carnegie unit and seat time. And that's another piece that we talk about in the paper, that as long as schools are the place where you have to be to get credit for learning, and credit for learning is this conflagration of content with seat time with a grade, then schools have the monopoly on talking about whether you're ready to go. But we've got lots of organizations, that whole ring of organizations in that National League of Cities graphic are the exciting people who are really doing things in that learning space. And for us, what's exciting is we've got a chance to redefine learning. If we can redefine learning, we can redefine schools much more easily. And that's where I think we've got excitement. And the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching that's made the commitment to really think about how to, they said, we set up the Carnegie unit, we can take it apart. We have to take it apart in a responsible way that really replaces it with things that are about being competency driven, with this idea that you can get credit for learning in lots of different places, and you can bundle it together in different ways. And that's where I think we've got the excitement from people across the community to do this better.
Peter, I know you're doing a whole webinar with us and Andy Frischman from Big Picture Learning later, but just thinking about what's exciting is how much there's already movement happening, and what we've been working on, the kind of moving forward together has really been more about creating a space for people to become more aware of where they're getting traction and being able to link across efforts.
Yeah, no, this whole conversation is very, very encouraging, and although it's repetitive, it's repetitive in the right sense of the word.
Right.
We've gone from images of what we're like to the information base behind it, which I think was the big breakthrough for me. For any of us that have been in this long enough, it's not like this is new to us, but that research base that you put together really slams home. This is out there coming at us. In other words, this is demand, and all of the components are pretty well now understood. And I think then the shift to it being about the people, it's about the people in the infrastructure in terms of supporting this, is I think the final trick for all of us. And I think any of us in this business have been reflecting for the last, since you started this. And I think of all of our personal experience, I'm assuming that it's different in each community. But some version of the community has to have some leadership that was already there. And it could be a legislator, it could be somebody on the mayor's staff, it could be a community foundation player that has standing. One of the critical ones that I would identify as almost absolutely critical is in every community, there's got to be some business group or business leader that happens to be a Boy Scout leader of some sort that is willing to take on the conversation in the leadership of the business community. Because I think there's plenty in the arts community, there's plenty in the library kind of information system. So this idea of getting some sort of a coordinating group, and again, just to make these short circuits, things like the Pritchard Committee in Kentucky, it's been around for 30 years. And it has outlasted every commissioner and every superintendent, and it can still call to task on core values. Maybe they're not ours yet, but my point is, I think putting the work into developing the coordinated structure around some critical components of the ecosystem and some individual players, wherever that is. And then the rest is in the nits. And you know that Hillary Salmon's, the work she did in Providence.
Yes.
And it's unbelievable. And yet, as much as, and I was a commissioner supporting her, and she had a mayor that supported her, but and even after all those years, we didn't quite make the whole circle and get a complete, including the things you're not talking about now. Where's the trade-off between the public sector investment, the private sector investment, the foundation investment? All of those things need to be constantly on the table, kind of being rethought while we're building this kind of infrastructure of personal commitment among the leaders and the outreach in terms of who's getting the services. So my point is, I think you got the pieces right, and we have to keep this conversation going about community by community. What's the strategy to find those critical leaders? What's the strategy behind getting the message and the eloquence? You people are speaking it so well now and so quickly that I'm still taking notes, and I think I understand this stuff. So we've got to not, I don't mean slow it down. It's got to repeat it to the right people at the right time in the right communities. And it is about the people. It's about the coordination. It's about the components. Oh, and the other big one, because I started out, Karen, like you, in many roles, but my first one in education happened to be in an alternative middle school. I have known about the middle school issue for 40, 50 years. Every time I have an image of the public school sector that the kids are, no matter where you are, up through about the 4th or 5th grade, they still trust the teacher. They still hug the teacher hugs them. They tend to talk to parents. All of a sudden you go into middle school and they're in 7 different classes. They lose their sense of community. There's no focus on networking in the cultural sense of kids developmentally. This link we're making between the early childhood opportunity and entering it more aggressively in the middle schools, because every kid that leaves middle school with any especially your images of how many of 2 out of the 4 competencies, every middle schooler that leaves with a few of those will make it through high school in spite of the high school.
That's right.
So that's the other thing for me is the middle school opportunity is also good because there's less regulation in the first place. You can pull this off in middle school without any of the kind of preoccupation with seat time or instructional time. So that's just a few of my thoughts. Never mind the big one, Karen. This is yours, and I say it all the time now. This has to be co-led, but primarily driven out to in. The outside, you're not going to get this voluntary in the best context. The leadership won't come from inside the system, inside the education system.
Yeah.
At best, it's going to come in following this demand side of the public side, and that this idea of what constitutes learning, how do we measure that learning, how do you credential that learning, where is it recorded in a profile that the student owns and can be used for everything from the next job to the next placement in education. That energy has got to be, in our vocabulary, community-based, and don't assume that it's going to come from the school out. It's most likely to come from from a healthy conversation in the community as a demand coming in.
And I appreciate all of that. And I'm also, Peter, I'm just excited as we continue that conversation. And Lucas, I'm also looking at kind of what you put in the chat and the other folks on like how it's sort of, there's lots of knowledge base. There are lots of structures and things to already kind of build upon. On pages 42, 43 of the paper, you're looking at that we talk about some of them, we call it like debated, even whether to say, we say nascent infrastructure. Some of these infrastructures are really strong, but I think in some ways nascent for getting outside of their own focus area.
Yeah,
So like we
right.
mentioned, the community schools, the provider networks, the governmental reporting bodies, the workforce development work, the opportunity youth various, like their mobilization campaigns. Ralph Smith and colleagues ran the campaign for grade level reading. There's a lot of things that are happening in the community level, and exactly that point of, in some ways, at the community level. And that's what worked for years. It's like, well, which of these do you have already? But it's also for those to say, and this is something like personally for me as sort of a coach to community collaboratives that sort of work to take a collective impact and a community organizing approach, cradle to career, balancing out the indicators, all these things. Oftentimes you would still come together and people would have their lanes. And I think one of the things that we're all pushing each other on right now is if you, where you kind of ended your comments, Peter, if we're focusing in on the experience of the young people, on what good learning and development experiences look like, the power of those relationships, the power of the people, that picture that Karen was putting up of, we can draw all the icons, we can draw all the places, we can probably draw most of the coordinating bodies, we can draw like the kinds of experiences and activities, but what about the people? What about the adults and the near peers working with young people every day in direct experiences and connecting them to others? How are we paying more attention to turning on that part of the ecosystem? And saying that's something that from what any of these collaboratives or coalitions or coordinating bodies, if we can be focusing in on the ecosystem of the young person, and making that healthy and the connections of the adults across that ecosystem, that I think is going to activate all of that. It turns us from a scarcity to an abundance model. That's going to help us activate now, not just in a far off, systems change future.
And I'm going to read the chat. Feel free to come off of mute and talk to us. But you're going to write a 4-page.
I love you, Philip.
Chat.
But you might be not where you can come off mic, so I understand.
Well, Lucas is sitting here. He can talk to us as well. But
there you go. Hi, guys.
Feel the microscope on me.
And it's great to see so many friends on the screen. Because we really need to keep this conversation going. But I just want to emphasize that, Peter, to your point about schools aren't going to be, we have to come from outside in. I think one of the things that we're learning, and one of the things that the Remake Learning folks in Pittsburgh area have done so well, is to invite the schools out. So it's not they can't do it. It's they are overwhelmed. It's very hard for them to see how to get from not being able to do what they're doing well to this idea of doing more, but doing it differently is what we need to do.
Oh, that's right.
Having people see that they can do it differently with other people requires personal trust. And what they've done in the Pittsburgh area is to really rely heavily on those intermediaries. They're not invisible anymore. Those intermediaries that are at the Pittsburgh Out of School Time Association, all those folks are really bringing their people together to say, how can we connect with these other people? And how can we just create these opportunities for learning and give you a little chance to talk? We need to reduce, when we talk about adolescents taking risks, we clearly need to create ways for adults to take more risks.
Absolutely.
Feel that they have the space to take risks and be supported. The last thing I'll say in this space, because I think really the science of learning and development, coupled with the science of adolescent development, makes us absolutely confident that we have enough resources to help our young people succeed if we can link those resources together. And we know we need the infrastructure, Michelle. We know we need those systems, but the connections really are at that relationship level. And every time we've got, someone talked about telling stories. Steve, you're talking about the importance of telling stories. Every time you look at the stories that are being told, when you've gotten people together, they have increased their optimism, they've increased their confidence, and they're increasing their retention. And so the shortages are shortages of exhaustion, being driven by exhaustion. And we can give people an opportunity to do this, to come into community with people slightly different from themselves, to see that they're not alone. And then also very quickly see that they can combine resources and they can work with kids differently. Something happens in that space. And I think those are the kind of stories that we need to tell with excitement. And that's one of the reasons that this community shared model is so important. He's a storyteller. Every time there's a project experience, they take a video of it, they have conversations about it, they have quotes about it, and he's got the data that shows that more people are connecting, everybody's getting better. The thing that the community network is actually growing, it can really show you the infrastructure of the ecosystem. And that's from a research perspective, a place that we haven't gotten. We don't know how to show what a healthy ecosystem looks like.
So I'm gonna as we come to the end of our hour, I'm gonna extend an invitation. Catherine's gonna come back on and tell you kind of just some immediate nexts. But there's a group of folks right now, and it is that are, when I've mentioned this Centering Youth Thriving conversation, that are people that are leading different coalitions and networks, the folks from Education Reimagined, XQ Institute, Science of Learning and Development Alliance, the Learner Studio folks who are working on just a big, like, what's the future? What's a, third way for a future of education in this country? The facilitators of those groups in the kind of education change space, as well as leaders in the youth development field, youth development researchers, folks at the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, also connecting it with the Opportunity Youth Network folks, are part of kind of a core team, but a larger group of folks. At this point, I think we had 75 people at the meeting in April, but there's about 150 folks that are actively in this conversation with us saying, how do we work together to advance to make this happen? And the kind of big swings, frankly, that we're looking at are the things coming up in the upcoming webinars. It's the credit for competency-based learning, when and where it's happening. Then Michelle will be talking about that. The community share idea. How do we get stewards kind of at multiple levels in community? How are we thinking about the workforce in a way, and those kind of the connections and the health of the workforce in doing that? And how are we having kind of a research base that really informs what it means to have a healthy and thriving ecosystem? What does that look like? Those are just a few of the kind of the areas where people are actively in conversation, engaging, looking at how to combine efforts, doing a little bit of lay of the land. What are the things that are already moving to be able to influence? And this is, for those, many of you on this call have been already in that work. For those of you who have not, we will send a follow-up note after this webinar and just invite you. If this is something that you would like to be connected to, in an ongoing way, we're figuring out beyond the small group conversations just what the next year could look like in terms of places to come together. We're also just showing up at a lot of the meetings that are already happening and having side meetings, because this is a little bit of a stone soup model at this point, but it is just trying to bring folks together that are really passionately trying to get to this, again, a different future that's not 20 years off, but it's really responding to where we are now. So that's the invitation. Please join us in the journey. And Catherine, what is up next?
I mean, before Catherine goes what's up next, I'm gonna take 30 seconds more to give you my favorite, my favorite wonky piece of data, which is, most of you know the search 40 assets. Yeah. And you know that search says the average young person has 20 of those 40 assets, and they do fine. And that we know there's a direct correlation between how many assets the young person has and how well they're doing in terms of positive attributes, or how poorly they're doing in terms of risk indicators. Straight line in the data, in the report. Think about this. If you ask how many ways are there to get to 20 assets out of 40? Does anybody want to guess what the number of permutations are, the number of different pathways you can get to 20 assets?
I was a math teacher, but I can't do it.
1,372,000 different ways that young people can look at 40 assets and get to 20. And combine to get to 20. And that's why we have to think about the abundance. Every young person can find a way to build the assets that they need to have to succeed and thrive. That's why if we start to shift from talking about systems, which are always focused on deficits and scarcity, to talking about assets and abundance in our communities and in our people who are trapped in the systems, we will succeed. So Catherine, what comes next? And you're on mute.
Great. I know. Thank you. Another paper has just been released, written by Karen and Merita, another commissioned paper on the XQ competencies, a comparative review of leading student learning frameworks. So I will drop that link in the chat. And that ties directly to our next webinar, which is coming up on August 20th. We'll be featuring Michelle Cahill. We'll really be looking at how the XQ competencies anchor youth thriving and can propel broader transformation. So I've also dropped a link to that one in the chat so you can register today. And up above, but I'll drop again a link to view the rest of the series. As Karen and Merita mentioned, we have one coming up on September 3rd featuring community share, and then one on September 17th, really looking at credit for learning. And as Merita mentioned, if you want to stay engaged, I will again drop the link. We've got a quick Google form. If you're already engaged, already on our Centering Youth Thriving email list, don't worry about filling it out. But for those of you who are newer to this conversation, we'd love to have you join us. So that is what we have coming up. We are so grateful to you all for giving us the time today. We hope we will see you on August 20th. That one is a 90-minute webinar. So as you're planning, plan accordingly. We look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thank you. And we look forward to seeing
Thank
you,
you.
Pete. September 17th. Peter will come talk to us more. Good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all.
And us.
All right, let me stop sharing and stop recording.